Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 131st episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. This month's theme is all about recognition. In particular, recognizing things we may take for granted and things outside our sphere of reference. So on today's episode, I'm going to be talking about how true crime podcasts can help us to see bias. I thought this was especially interesting because the theme of International Women's Day is breaking the bias. So if you're a regular listener or this is your first episode, I'd really be grateful if you get to the end of the show, you leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. In addition, I love hearing from listeners. So if you want to drop me a line and tell me what you thought, I reply directly. And my email address is Layla, Leyla, @diverseminds.co.uk. Okay, so why did I decide to connect bias and true crime podcasts? Well, I'm sure I'm late to the party, but lockdown definitely had me listening for the first time to true crime podcasts. Now, it's not the serial killer kind, but I'm really fascinated by fraud and scammers and how they get away with it. And I found it really fascinating as I really don't know how anyone has the gall or audacity to carry out such schemes with confidence, the way they get away with them. And so linking to bias, there's been a lot of talk about bias, particularly unconscious bias in the workplace over the last 10 years. With a focus on recruitment, who gets promoted. And in a training environment, I often think that talking about bias can really turn people off. And in fact, there's evidence that shows that unconscious bias training can be more of a hindrance than a help. And people sitting in sessions can often be like, yeah, tell me something I don't know. Or it can also have a sense of, oh, well, everyone's a little bit it's okay. But I think true crime podcasts, because they're so well produced and they tend to be quite high budget, there's a lot of research that goes into it. They're very sensitive because there are lots of victims and survivors of fraud and people who scam. They really suck us into the story and can provide the opportunity for us to take time and reflect. So first of all, what is bias? And in particular, unconscious bias? I just want to recap on this to frame the discussion. So unconscious bias refers to a bias, something that we're unaware of, and it happens outside of our control. It's thought that it happens automatically and is triggered by our brains making quick judgments and assessments of people and situations that have been influenced by our background, cultural environment, and personal experience. You may have also heard it referred to as implicit, hidden, or associate bias. So implicit because it's kind of there. It's a bit like if someone does a knee test and your leg kicks out. Hidden because we don't know that it's there. And associative because it's one thing associating our thoughts with another. Implicit people preferences are formed by socialization. So potentially you had a best friend with a particular name. Maybe you feel warm towards people who also have that name. Past experiences influence our thinking. So if we had a teacher that we loved and they looked a particular way, we might feel warm towards people who look similarly or wear similar things. And it's also exposure to others' views about groups of people. So thinking about the media, we may not know people from particular backgrounds, but we might just read things or see things, and that can skew us in a positive way or a negative way. And I love the Anais Nin quote that we see the world as we are, not as it is, even though people like to think they're neutral and no one is. And all humans will use this quick thinking every day to help us function and navigate our way through the world. Because when we as humans interact with one another, it is not always possible to process everything about each new person we encounter. We like shortcuts, our brain doesn't want to be overloaded. So information about people is often suppressed or grouped and placed into easy to access categories based on our previous experience. We form then emotional associations about groups of people which we activate unconsciously and automatically as a quick way of making these judgments and assessments. When our bias controls our processes in this way, we're not always able to mitigate this very rapid and instinctive categorization. The associations are very strong, which in turn impact our behavior positively or negatively in quite subtle ways, which bypass our self-awareness. So I wanted to mention some of the podcasts that I listened to that really brought this to the forefront for me. The first one being The Fake Heiress, which is all about Anna Delvey. Of course, the excellently produced The Dropout about Elizabeth Holmes. The Lazarus Heist, which is about North Korea and cyber attacks. Have You Seen This Man Series 2, which focused on someone called John Rufo. Who the Hell is Hamish by the Australian, who's in prison now. He's in prison now for completing really horrific scams on people around pension investments. And The Immaculate Deception, around a doctor in the Netherlands who was treating women potentially, well, he was using his own sperm and not doing artificial insemination in correct ways. So these are just a few. Also The Missing Crypto Queen, which was fascinating, BBC production about Dr. Ruja. So I think what's interesting is from these podcasts, for me, I could really see how things were overlooked. There was a lack of due diligence, which pushed to one side, positive qualities exaggerated. There was a slither of credibility, which was then seen as huge competencies, and also the negative assumptions around people that enabled them to get away with certain behaviors because of the perception that, oh, well, they're just a nobody. They would never be able to do that. So I really hope you're enjoying the content of this podcast and you want to keep up to date. Then please join my bi-monthly newsletter. By joining my mailing list, you'll receive a free copy of my ebook, The Mentally Healthy Leading Manager. And the link, in case you need it and you can't check the show notes, is https://bit.ly/MHLMEBK21. So let's go back to these types of biases then and how they relate to the characters of the individuals that were in the podcast. So first of all, if we break it down, and please be aware, I'm not a psychologist. This is from years of learning and reading about things, presenting things on bias, but there is more documented and researched information out there. So if you're interested, I will include some links in the show notes. But first of all, affinity bias. So this leads to us favoring people who look, sound, and behave like us over others who do not. We may also ignore the faults of people we like and notice the faults more of people from groups we unconsciously don't like. So people that we like more, we interpret what they say more positively and we might listen to them more intently. And we may miss or misinterpret what people who less like us say or try to tell us. Then there's confirmatory bias. This leads us to seek out and weigh information which confirms what we already thought, as well as being blind to evidence which contradicts this. And I think this is something we saw a lot with Elizabeth Holmes, that people thinking that she was absolutely brilliant. There was lots of mention of the way she looked, this really young, attractive blonde woman. That was said a lot if you listen to the Dropout, the trial, how people were taken in by her. Yes, she had gotten into an Ivy League university. She dropped out. She was seen as a real genius. Now, I'm not denying her intelligence levels, but I think that the due diligence and the questions that should have been asked from her weren't asked. And so confirmatory bias is often accompanied by overall impressions, assumptions, and prejudgments about likely outcomes. And it's often the case that we would rather gather the right evidence to justify our decision, and there was a lot of that going on. And this may include accepting evidence from sources that people wouldn't usually, like hearsay or rumor, or, if someone says someone's fabulous, everyone's like, oh yes, they are fabulous. The third one is attribution bias, and this affects the way we decide the cause of behavior and outcomes. So for ourselves and people that we like, aka the in-group, we tend to attribute failure externally. So it was the situation, it was the circumstances for them, and success internally. We were born for this, natural aptitude, excellence. And for people who are different or unlike us, we might say the out-group that the reverse is true. So success might be attributed to the team effort or luck for those in the out-group, but to talent and effort for those in the in-group. Then there's comparison bias, and this occurs when we compare people, as comparing people tends to exaggerate any differences. So in assessments and reviews, we're inclined to ignore any organizational standards and compare employees with each other. So going back to the workplace again, and it might be a case that performance is polarized more than perhaps is the reality. Also, what researchers found is that men often get massaged up and women get massaged down in terms of scores for these kinds of things. Someone or their performance may emerge as clearly superior when in fact the differences are much less than we perceive. Agency bias arises when assertive, forthright, decisive behavior is not experienced equally positively when demonstrated by different groups. Unfortunately, we see this a lot. In the case of white men, in particular in the West, they're seen as possessing decisiveness and leadership when they're assertive, maybe slightly loud and forthright. And particularly with women and women of color. When we raise our voices, we're seen as aggressive and rude by men and women alike. You also see it when men do a little bit of the office housework, so picking up a mug from the desk when the meeting is over, or childcare. No one uses the term working fathers, but we hear the term working mothers all the time. And if women don't do those behaviors, they're seen as unhelpful and very negative and not team players. Then there's groupthink, and this arises due to the natural tendency of groups to minimize conflict by converging on a decision as it appears to be gathering support. So groupthink arises due to the natural tendency of groups to minimize conflict by converging on a decision as it appears to be gathering support. So this might be something really familiar to you in the work, but also the family place. So groupthink is usually apparent if there is minimal diversity of background, perspectives, experiences, and viewpoints with a team, board, or business. And we see this in society around who has the right to be in certain areas. And of course, they can't possibly be that bad. It can also occur in any kind of system or organization where people have worked together for a long time and unconsciously want to maintain the consensus. Then we have the halo effect, and this arises from the tendency to assume that because an individual shines in one area or in one aspect of life, they will also be amazing across the board. So they have fantastic creative skills, therefore they'll be a brilliant people manager, which is something we see in the workplace a lot. And then salience bias, that arises from noticing dramatic or other distinctive stimuli disproportionately. An event, it could be good or bad, from the past that stands out can continue to affect the individual's reputation as evidence. So they messed up a restructure. There's no way they could then lead a team in a different way, even though those circumstances may have been very challenging. This is then likely to link to that confirmation and attribution bias. Again, we often see that people of color in global majority Black diaspora communities can be sent in to do jobs that are impossible to sort out and fix. It doesn't go to whoever's hired them's plan, and then it's like, oh, look, we tried, but they're so awful. I think we also see that with disabled employees as well. And then cognitive overload, and that's just to say when people are more tired and under time pressure, the more vulnerable they are. And so when we're tired, we want to make those quick decisions. We want to get over it. And just like a physical muscle, we have to be aware and be questioning and open. And if we're exhausted and depleted, we can make those shortcut decisions. So I thought it was useful to talk about some of those and then to go back to the podcast I mentioned and talk about what might be going on. So I mentioned the fake heiress, first of all about Anna Delvey. And it's interesting because she has, of course, been released from prison. There's a series that's just gone out about her, mixed reviews on that one. And I've not watched the series, but I did find the fake heiress podcast brilliant. And Anna Delvey, at the time when she was discovered, her father apparently gave an interview, and they play a clip in the podcast of it. And he supposedly said that it's the system that's at fault. And I absolutely agree with him. And what I thought was very interesting about Anna Delvey was, yes, she did one of her friends talks in the podcast, her former friends, about what she did to her and how she got her into an enormous amount of credit card debt. But I couldn't help thinking while I was listening to it that if Anna had been from an African-American, Black, global majority diaspora, Latinx background, I really don't think she would have had the access to the spaces she ended up having access to. She started working in small fashion magazines and told everyone that she was a German heiress. And I just don't think, from my own lived experience, that someone of color would have been believed in that way. And just the gall she had, it's quite amazing. I'm not standing up for her behavior for a second, but the way she would book lavish parties and then just not pay the bill and disappear. But who else would have been allowed to book parties in those venues without being checked? And I think for me, that's very interesting. Like, this is the perception. This is what we expect a European heiress to be like, with a bit of an accent, very self-assured, petite, fashionable, in with the right people. Again, very interesting the way she created this web around herself. Then, as I mentioned in the Dropout, Elizabeth Holmes. So she is an incredibly smart person. She did drop out of an Ivy League university. I think what I find very fascinating about this case, and if you've listened to the podcast series or read about her, is why she lied. Because I think maybe she could have brought her vision to fruition. Not one drop of blood being able to carry out thousands of tests for different diseases, but even if she developed something that was able to test 15 to 20 different diseases and measurements of wellness, it still would have been much better than what she did. And I still can't fathom, personally, not necessarily related to bias, but how she just carried on and on and on. But there was lots going on here around expectations. People, again, thought she was brilliant. I think she really went after some very interesting American organizations that were family businesses. So Walmart was one of them, and the Waltons. And this connection she was able to create with people around her vision, and how she got people to really, really believe in her. So for me, there was a lot of affinity bias, people like her, definitely associating with her, because she came from a very prominent family, the Fleischmann's yeast family, and the confirmatory bias around, oh yes, well, the way in which she presented herself gave the overall impression and assumption that she was a very competent person. And I think people were seeking that confirmation. They didn't want to believe that what was happening, and this wasn't everyone that she was in contact with, but it was a majority of people. And when two individuals tried to call her out and whistleblow, the way in which they were punished was pretty horrific, particularly one woman who actually happened to be of Southeast Asian American heritage. And the way she was treated, and she was followed, and she wasn't believed, but she gave evidence. You know, a woman who's very upright and obviously believes in doing things the right way, but she was totally dismissed and wasn't believed. Another sort of lab director, he ended up taking his own life from the way he was treated, and nothing's been done about that. So again, very interesting to see. And how when these cases come out, often the thought is, how on earth did this happen? And then when you start to dig in, you can see the role that bias had to play. The Lazarus heist, again, what was really interesting for me on this one was with the Sony Pictures hack, when it initially happened, no one believed that, the theory was it came from, the reason it happened was because of the motion picture based on Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and that it was absolutely fine for white Western America to create a film that was deeply humiliating. Now, you might have a personal opinion about North Korea. There are things that are going on, but I do think, for me, the bias is around, we as a white Western superpower can ridicule and make fun of anyone we want to. So again, that kind of hierarchy, and that nothing's going to touch us and nothing's going to happen to us. It's a kind of inward halo effect for me, assuming that we are a shining, amazing example, and that we are so democratic, we can't criticize people. I'm not saying we shouldn't be able to criticize other forms of leadership, but I do feel, and if you listen to that podcast, first couple of episodes, the arrogance and the kind of ignoring that no one can touch us really, really stuck with me. I thought of the arrogance, I thought of the emails that had come out, things that come out of Sony, the racist language, the things that senior members had been saying about Barack Obama. I mean, it really is shocking. Talk about in-groups and out-groups. For me, that really revealed that, and just how shocking the hack was. Then Have You Seen This Man? Series 2, particularly focused on John Rufo. I haven't listened to series 1 because it is about a brutal murder, and I really didn't want to hear that. But this again was fascinating. So John Rufo, not to spoil the punchline for you, but he's absconded. No one can find him. Where is he? And he had committed fraud on quite a large scale with a partner, and the collaborator was in prison for, I think it was 27 years, a long period of time. John Rufo was due to report into prison. The trial had gone through and he absconded. He disappeared very cleverly. Again, it's absolutely fascinating how he did it. No one knows where he is. He didn't contact anyone from his former life. But again, who would be, if this individual had been from a Black global majority diaspora background, he wouldn't have been allowed to hand himself in. He would have been arrested straight after the trial. So that in itself was interesting for me. And throughout this podcast, the snippet that comes through is, well, he was this like computer geek, short man. He wasn't really up to much. He ran a successful business, but hey, who thought he was capable of this? Everyone just thought he was a bit of a geek in the corner. And as a result, he was underestimated. He hired a guy, he parked at JFK airport, and no one knows whether he left the country because he had lots of aliases. So another very, very fascinating one in terms of how he was able to do that. And people's assumptions of him and what he wasn't capable of meant he was basically able to carry out something shockingly spectacular. And I'm not praising it at all. Again, it goes back much like Anna Delvey, the gall to do that. Then who the hell is Hamish? I think it was very tragic the way Hamish used people to defraud them and get them to put their money in pension pots it was a Ponzi scheme essentially. But again, this person was white. This person was very flashy. He used to buy himself watches, the way in which he used to find women. And interestingly, the women talk about the fact that he didn't inappropriately touch them or inappropriately do things with them initially, how he got their trust. He was a very good listener, the image he managed to paint of himself, the kind of debonair financier, if you like. And so what is expected? And again, if he had Aboriginal heritage, for example, my sense is, from knowing a little bit about race politics and race and identity, the way in which Aboriginal people are seen in Australia, the original people, this just probably wouldn't have happened, even if they'd been legitimate financiers who hadn't committed any fraud or any crime. And then the immaculate deception, again, this is incredibly distressing for anyone who has had fertility challenges or maybe really wanted a child or has been through something similar. But you have this white doctor who had worked in Suriname, and my heart sank when I heard this in the podcast, because I just thought, oh my goodness, what must he have done in Suriname during the times of Dutch colonialism that hasn't been picked up? We're talking about what he did in the Netherlands in the 70s and 80s, but how he was allowed to get away with it. And in all of these cases, when people raised the alarm, they were ignored because of the power and the biases that were at play here. And then, of course, the missing crypto queen, so Dr. Ruja, and she had actually gone to Oxford, and the way she capitalized on that. So when they did the podcast and they did research, they found she'd done a master's there. But she took out adverts, and the adverts talked about her Oxford credentials. So once again, we have that confirmatory bias. Well, she must be brilliant because she's gone to Oxford. We've got the agency bias. She was very assertive, forthright, and decisive. She would stand up on the podium and convince people about OneCoin. Halo effect, because she shined and she was a brilliant presenter. She was able to, really, she must be running this amazing business. But of course, there was no cryptocurrency behind it. There was no blockchain behind it. So I hope I haven't spoiled these for you, but I just couldn't, when I was listening to them throughout these, last few months, I just kept thinking, wow, this is just bias in action. And I don't think any one business has solved it. I think training can be useful to an extent, but it's really about how we all consider and think about all of it. So next time you listen to a similar podcast and think about the errors, think about how they were made. How was this allowed to happen? Why were they made? What were the assumptions about the individual that enabled this thing to happen? And then I would say reflect your own areas in your work, and how is this bias playing a negative impact? How is it massaging egos? How is it enabling people to think positively when they should be questioning? And how could you mitigate against this? Now, these are big questions, but remember that we all have bias. It is part of the human condition, if you like. Our brain wants to enable us to interpret information in a quick way. And what we think is quick isn't always logical. What we want to try and do is take a step back and reflect. Training isn't always the answer. It can be part of a picture. But how can we use stories, and particularly around stories where things have gone wrong, and learn from those and consider how this relates to our own work? So I really hope you've enjoyed the show. You've enjoyed this topic. Please, as I said, why not write me a review on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast from. Check out the show notes for more resources, and I look forward to catching up with you in the next episode. So take care, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.